Exide.
The Exide.
Exide, the operator of a former battery recycling plant.
For them.
And I'll tell you something. This is our Flint, Michigan. This is our Flint, Michigan because people have had to endure contamination, exposure, and physical abnormalities because of that exposure. And it's time for us to say that it's got to stop.
Over the last 3 decades, Los Angeles County has experienced several large environmental challenges. One of the biggest environmental challenges facing the 1st District is the contamination caused by the now closed Exide battery recycling plant.
So, yeah, I think when we first started, we didn't really know what to expect. We just knew that we were tasked with going out into the community to try to let residents know what was happening as far as the Exide contamination, especially making sure that all residents had access to resources. That was probably our kind of guiding principle. We didn't want any residents to not know that they could get help or have their questions answered. So that really was a big part of when we first started.
The Exide facility opened in the early 1920s, and it opened up as a secondary lead smelter. It operated for many decades until there was a change in state and federal laws that strengthened the requirements that most of these facilities would have to comply with. For some unexplainable reason, Exide was never required to upgrade to meet the new standards. So they continued to operate into the 80s and 90s and beyond 2000, in the early 2000s, without the benefit of those stricter regulations that would have minimized the pollution from the facility and lessened the extent to which the surrounding community was exposed. When you fast forward, and I think really there were concerns expressed by the community for many years, probably 20, 30 years that at least we know of. The community was concerned about Exide and what impact it might be having on their community. And so if we fast forward now into the early 2000s, specifically 2013, the Air Quality Management District had required that Exide perform a risk assessment. The purpose of these assessments is to determine whether or not a facility's emissions are potentially impacting the health of the surrounding community. And that risk assessment was alarming, both to the regulatory agencies and to the community, because it did indicate that the operations of Exide and the air emissions had resulted in a substantially elevated risk of developing long-term illness among approximately 100,000 residents in the surrounding communities. So that really then did change the attention that was placed on Exide. In a way, it validated the concerns that residents of those communities have had for many years.
Exide Technologies operated for over 30 years in the city of Vernon, releasing an estimated 7 million pounds of lead and other hazardous materials in the surrounding communities of East LA, Boyle Heights, Commerce, Maywood, Bell, Huntington Park, and Vernon.
Welcome to a special edition of LA Now. Today we are focusing on the Exide environmental crisis, and we're at an East LA neighborhood, one of hundreds that were possibly affected by the closed battery recycling plant. The Department of Public Health is testing the soil now to see how far the damage has gone.
As you agitate the sample a little bit, the finer particles drop to the bottom, and once that process is done, we're now ready to collect some of that sample.
With $2 million in funding from the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, specialists like Tony Ward are on an urgent mission. They have fanned out to test the soil in hundreds of homes to determine if they were exposed to high levels of chemicals near and around the now shuttered Exide battery recycling plant in Vernon.
This field demonstration effort was vitally important to speeding up the process, in that it had previously taken the state 18 months to test 500 properties. And with 10,000 properties to go, there had to be a quicker method of testing the properties and prioritizing them for cleanup. So our field demonstration project tested 500 properties in 10 days. Again, this was a task that had taken the state over 18 months to complete previously. And based on our successful demonstration, the state revised their testing methods and was able to fully test all of the 10,000 properties, at least those that were accessible to them.
Youth, you say action! Youth! Action! Youth! Action! Youth! Action! Youth! Action!
Exide was a major problem, a major contaminant in our community that had been allowed to exist for well over 33 years with a permit that had expired. Make no mistake about it, we have got to go after the responsible parties, and that is Exide.
Just yesterday, one of our members, longtime member, that we affectionately call Nico, her house was tested in the City of Commerce, and they found priority 2 levels on her property. This is a home that was her mother's home, it's her home, her children's home, and her grandchildren's home.
I am asking and I am begging for the legislature and all levels of government to clean this up immediately.
Last June, Supervisor Solis and the Department of Public Health partnered on an extraordinary community health outreach campaign called Let's Talk About Exide. The goal of the event was to conduct door-to-door community outreach to over 20,000 homes within 1.7 miles from the former Exide facility.
You have probably never seen an environmental outreach this big in Los Angeles. Volunteers visiting 20,000 homes near the old Exide battery recycling plant in Vernon. Though closed for 2 years now, the factory's pollution lingers.
My grandma, she has cancer.
Danielle Aguirre says her grandmother was diagnosed with breast cancer last year, and the family is now considering it may have been triggered by decades of lead and arsenic pollution spewing from the factory. Aguirre, who was mostly unaware of the plant's history, is glad volunteers are here to enlighten.
Bringing awareness to everybody about what's going on, so we could reevaluate our health and see hey, well, maybe there's more to it.
We are in the thick of the campaign. Some 1,500 volunteers like the ones you see behind me going door to homes within a 2-mile radius of the now shuttered Exide battery plant. They're trying to figure out if homeowners in this area were affected, and if so, will help hook them up with services.
It's important that the community understand that they should not let their children be barefoot in the dirt. They should not touch the dirt. They should not play in the mud. They should not, pregnant women are not supposed to walk on that contaminated area.
Monsignor John Moretta of Resurrection Church and School says some residents don't know that much of the area's soil is contaminated. Lead exposure can also cause problems in pregnancy and learning disabilities in children. So volunteers with LA County Supervisor Hilda Solis are expanding their outreach to families in East LA, Bell, and other communities.
And hear them to see what impacts this might have had on their family, on their children, whether it's asthma, whether it's lead poisoning, and to help them navigate and understand the county system and how we can provide services.
Residents say they're glad LA County government is looking out for them.
One thing to just note is we had teams out here for the last 3 weeks completing the door knocking and left bags of information where residents weren't home and collected more surveys. So the report you see is what we're calling an interim report. We'll enter in the new data and we'll have a final report ready for you in a couple of weeks.
So people were really concerned. One was that we found that a lot of people still were not aware that they were potentially exposed to higher levels of lead. So that we know that they need still more education about it. We also found out that a lot of people were concerned about their risk of cancer, especially since it may not show up for 10, 20 years later. Another thing that people were concerned about is if they had young kids or if they were pregnant, they were concerned about what were the effects on my child or my unborn child.
It was a busy afternoon at an elementary school in Maywood as parents like Eudauco Pulido brought their children to get their blood drawn. To see if they were affected or not, said Eudauco.
So the purpose of this event is to test the children for their blood lead levels, and it can give the parents a sense of comfort.
All of the families being tested live near the now closed Exide battery recycling facility in Vernon and are at high risk for exposure to toxic substances like lead.
We're willing to pull nurses out from kind of other duties to really get out into the community and answer the questions, especially the health-related questions. I think when you have like a medical expert and the team that supports that, I think it shows the residents and the community that the county really cares, that the county really wants to make sure that the questions are answered by health professionals. But I definitely have to say that as soon as you knock on the door and you say, I'm a nurse, I'm here to help, that doors that were normally closed get opened. I think that's one of the big things that sticks in my mind just from going out there.
Well, I'm really amazed that the department was willing to put in so much effort in an area that historically has not been well served or listened to, that in general, compared to other more affluent areas, it's a lot more difficult to get the attention of departments and government to actually address the issue.
Although Governor Brown allocated $176 million in cleanup funds for these neighborhoods, the cleanup process has not been swift or efficient. It has been 3 years since the Exide plant closed, and thousands of residents are still waiting on cleanup.
Sometimes you have to take that step back and you're like, you're gonna do this because you're serving the community. I think that's part of why we become public servants.
What we would like the community to know is that the County of Los Angeles stands with them on their desire to have this site cleaned up as quickly as possible and to restore more healthy conditions within their community. And that we're in this for the duration. We are not going to stop until the proper cleanup is completed and the last home is cleaned to the appropriate standards.
Supervisor Solis and the County of Los Angeles remain committed to this issue and to the impacted communities. In fact, a couple weeks ago, Supervisor Solis was able to secure an additional $5.2 million through the County Department of Public Health for lead paint cleanup near the Exide facility. This funding will provide relief for the tens of thousands of residents affected by the Exide contamination who have been enduring an environmental injustice for way too long. All residents throughout LA County deserve clean air. Ya basta.